Vernomatic Productions.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are gold.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC. A proud member of the Pantheon podcast team.
It's getting nice and heavy.
Now, welcome our hosts, John the Vernomatic Verno, direct from New Jersey, Metal Walt, and from the band Motorlord, Ian O'Rourke.
Good evening, everybody. As always, Thursday night comes around, we drop some new content. Tonight, we have another fun one. We're revisiting the year 1992 as me and my metal brothers continue our series, The History of Metal. Quickly, just want to remind you, get up to the website, metalmayhemroc.com, join our community, sign up for the newsletter, check out some past shows, and subscribe, review, and download these episodes. That being said, let me get my metal brothers on. From Central New York, Ian O'Rourke, and from New Jersey, Metal Walt. Hey, guys, how are you?
Glad to see you guys. How y'all doing?
We are back, 1992.
Yeah, man.
So, 1992, I'm going to describe 1992 as a whole as an everything bagel. It's like it's got some sesame seeds, some salt, some garlic, maybe a little bit cinnamon. Maybe it's got part marble, part wheat. The whole analogy, though, is 1992. There were something like, I don't know, I counted it, like 150 to 200 hard rock metal releases that year. But it's like a hodgepodge of genres, right? You still have the 80s bands hanging on. You still have the classic bands, or, you know, the bands we love and grew up on releasing stuff. There's albums, live albums coming out. The 90s albums are kicking into high gear. Then you have this new piece of metal coming in on the backside. So it's an abundance of numbers, but the question maybe we're going to discuss tonight is the substance there? So, Ian, you know what? We always try to make a cheat sheet ahead of time. There's a top 10 list, right? But was there really one or two or three winners? Was there that 1984 album in 1982?
92, yeah. It was, you know, we were chatting quick off air. I mean, the one standout would be, you know, Pantera's Vulgar Display of Power, just because of what it was at the time. You know, it's a big jump from Cowboys from Hell to Vulgar Display of Power. And, you know, the leapfrogs that these guys were making and the impact, excuse me, that they were having on the rest of the metal community with their music was not to be denied. But it was, you know, if you had to do a 1, 2, 3, you know, countdown to extinction was big, but it wasn't Rust in Peace, you know, as far as, you know, at least from a musical appreciation perspective. You know, it had a lot of radio hits, was still kind of heavy. And then, it's tough, you know, I mean, really going off script from what my list personally is, I would have to say White Zombie, Le Sexorcisto. I mean, that thing was everywhere. All that stuff was everywhere, you know, MTV.
Well, and that's the point, right?
Yeah.
I think you saw White Zombie, you saw Alice in Chains and Stone Temple Pilots. I mean, they were probably the three biggest albums in rock. Yeah. Forget metal of 1992. You know, and that was the redefinition of that era to come, but that would also drop off really quick.
Yeah.
Right. These bands were off the charts in a couple of years, but let's go back to that Pantera album. Let's not forget the influence that had on the genre, because this was a hair band, band that, you know, cut its teeth in the 80s. They had Terry Glaze as the singer. You know, Phil Anselmo came in. We talked to Jason McMaster about how he goofed on the audition and didn't, passed it down twice. Right. You know, Mr. Paul called, Mr. Abbott. He said no thanks, and then Vinnie Paul called and he said no thanks again. But anyway, look at that album cover of Pantera. Oh, yeah. The fist in the face. You know, Phil Anselmo in those videos, just he looked like Rocky Balboa coming out of that. Verno, what was your take on Pantera? What was the sound like to you?
Well, just quickly rewinding to the comment about these bands and nothing was really big. The rock and metal landscape splintered, and there's just like like it exploded in a way that there's just so many bands, and now they all. When the debris finally fell down, you had like the STPs, you had the Rage Against the Machines, this whole different kind of rock, new metal, alternative. Then later on, you found out that they really were just, hard rock
guys. Yeah.
But Pantera, honestly, to this day, I never really got into them. When they came around, I remember I was in college and I tried, and, there's some metalheads were playing Vulgar Display and Cowboys from Hell. And I was like, I never moved the needle in my metal world.
Well, they had I think the video Walk, that's probably a signature metal song. If you think all-time top 10 metal riffs, probably Walk is on that list, right? It's just, you hear it all the time. They did get that MTV airplay, and they were the guys in short cut-off jeans and flannel shirts, still with the heavy metal beards, but they had that tough attitude, man. These guys were no bullshit. This was not the grunge look. This was the new post-'80s hair out of like the colorful pinks and purples of the world into this new look of the 90s.
Right.
I think I'm going to plead the get off my lawn guy, but I really wasn't paying attention to it. It was like... Never really got into it.
Well, and it was also a slow growth. That was like they cut their teeth this year. And we talked about it on the 1991 episode, how they were the opening act for Skid Row on their Slave to the Grind tour. And little by little, over the next 2 to 3 years, they would be the face of metal in a dark time for metal. In the mid to late 90s, Pantera was at that top. Yep. They were the coolest new band, playing the Ozfest and that kind of thing. They were that like, number 1B band under Ozzy or Sabbath.
Well, and, think about some of the lineups that they had as headliners. They came to the Utica Odd in, the early 90s. I don't know if it was between 92 and 94 or after 94, but they had Marilyn Manson on the bill with them. They ripped the seats, the fans did, out of the Odd and were chucking them into the crowd, throwing them the debris around, and they were banned for years to not be able to play there. These guys, they really kind of had it was they had this consistent momentum that was building. And yes, it was different than what we were accustomed to with the the Megadeth and the Metallicas and the Slayers and stuff. It was a little bit of a different breed, but they really made a big impact, with what they were doing. Not to discount it, I gotta go back too, because the Dirt album by Alice in Chains was really something huge. And, I probably should have had it as like a 3A and 3B, but I remember when that came out, it was a lot more thought provoking than what Facelift was. You could see that escalation in their writing, and they really had a lot of great material. That's one of those albums. It's a, beginning to end kind of play album. So
yeah, I love that album too. I was all in on Alice in Chains by then. 150% in. Yeah. Went to see him on these tours, saw him at Lollapalooza a little bit later, saw him at the Ritz very early on in this tour.
Really?
And it was like that Seattle thing. It was Alice in Chains and I think the Screaming Trees.
Mark Lanigan. Yeah.
Yeah. But cool tour, good album.
Yeah.
And this was the band probably at its peak. It was almost second album in, but they couldn't be bigger.
Yeah.
Nothing could be bigger than Alice in Chains on this. And you're right, Ian. 13 songs on the album. Yeah. And it's 13 great songs.
Yeah.
Bottom line, hands down, no filler.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's one of those, it's kind of like a Back in Black kind of album. They had a bunch of singles that came out that were, top 10, top 5 singles, and everything else that wasn't a single was still great,
Well, and the sister album to that, I think, right, was
Sap.
The debut by Stone Temple Pilots, Core.
Yes, sure.
right? And I mean, they're unfairly categorized. They're not a Seattle band. I think they were out of San Diego. Actually, the DeLeo brothers are out of Origins, out of Point Pleasant, New Jersey, where my family has a summer home.
Yeah.
But I mean, FM radio to this day, we have a local station, WDHA FM. It's not unheard of that at least once a day you're going to hear something from this album.
Oh, sure.
I mean, Dead and Bloated, Sex type thing, Wicked Garden.
It's another great album, yeah.
Again, it's no filler on this one.
Yep.
I mean, and they got the coveted opening spot in the beginning of 93 or late 92, where they actually opened up for Megadeth on the Countdown to Extinction tour.
I remember
actually
that.
saw
yeah,
them.
That's right. I remember
so,
that.
Verno, where were you in 92 on these two bands?
You know, it's funny. You guys are sitting here talking, and it's all coming back to me. I was 25 years old, right out of college, getting serious with the girl that I ended up marrying. And I was going through a period in my life that, because I am a little older at that time, you know, it's like, where are my bands? I couldn't get past the name of the bands. Sure. Let alone to sit down and listen to them, honestly. And then it started getting like there was no guitar solos and everyone was picking on my generation. And so subconsciously, I never really went after these bands. I heard the music, you know, you heard all of it, but it's like, it's not Maiden. It's not, you know, it doesn't have the imagery. I didn't trust. The thing is, I didn't trust them. I almost felt left out. It's like I was getting older, and it was, again, I don't want to say get off my lawn guy because 25 is young, but that STP was cool. You know, Wicked Garden, you know, that was cool stuff. They were a rock band. There was
Cracker Man, that song kicks ass.
See, another thing was, when all that stuff started, and I said in the last episode, you know, fucking Nirvana, they're bitches, and, you know, it was just weird. You know, it was, I couldn't relate to this. I couldn't relate to Marilyn Manson. Right. I couldn't relate to, because you got to remember, back then in 92, some of this stuff was extreme. Right. The imagery, you know, Rob Zombie, Marilyn Manson, shit. When I remember Metal Mayhem ROC's Bill the Rager, we've been friends forever. I remember when he came over with that CD of Rage Against the Machine. And we opened it up and he goes, you got to check these guys out. And, you know, looking at the pictures, I couldn't really relate to Zach LaRocca and, you know, Tom Morello's guitar playing. I'm like, what's this? And it wasn't comfortable.
It was different. It was, you're right. It's not comfortable, but, and I think it was, you know what, to add to your point, Verno, we were uncomfortable with it and we were a little afraid because we're like, where's our music? Is it dead? Is it gone?
Yeah.
Do we like this? Am I going to be uncool if I say I like this? And then I'm going to be picked on for being like, dude, you're deserting Sabbath and Rush and Ozzy and Deep Purple because you like, you know, Rage Against the Machine. You're a fucking sellout, right?
Yeah.
But you look back at it 30 years later, the stuff's got some. I mean, it's Rage Against the Machine.
Yeah.
You went to every rock club. You went to see every band. And this was, you know, Killing in the Name was played on the PA system for every tour, for every band. Right. Probably on, I don't know how many shows I saw those years, but that was always one of the songs right before because it pumped the crowd up. You got all these stupid drunk fat guys going, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me. Fuck you, I won't do what you tell me, right?
Yeah, and then you've come to realize that there wasn't a bigger Randy Rhoads, Eddie Van Halen fan than Tom Morello.
I was just going to say.
And these guys, you know, it was almost like they gained my trust that, no, we're not picking on your bands. We love your bands. They're our bands too. Right. It's just, so this is turning into heavy metal therapy and I'm the patient.
It's all good, man. I was gonna go back and say though, between Tom Morello and the DeLeo brothers, these guys are guys that cut their teeth in hard rock and metal bands. That's what they grew up on. That's what they loved. Just like a lot of the other bands, you know, the Soundgardens, Alice in Chains. I mean, Christ, Van Halen and Alice in Chains toured together.
Yeah. And, you know, I saw all of Alice in Chains on those Clash of the Titans.
Yeah.
You know, and they gained,
Respect.
acceptance
Sure.
in the metal community. And so, I'm going to lean on you two because you're much more in tune with all that and have a lot more experiences. But let's revisit some of our bands that we are comfortable with in the 80s and what was going on. Shit like Def Leppard, Adrenalize.
Right.
There was post-hysteria. Was there anything there?
Yeah, it's, you had the big hit, Let's Get Rocked, right? That still got the MTV airplay. The rest of the album, name another song on the album you remember. There are none, right?
Yeah.
But I think what the theme of the Def Leppard to me is, you can throw in 5 or 6 or 10 other 80s bands that all fell into the category in 92, right? You had, and I'll name a few, Extreme, Firehouse, Faster Pussycat, LA Guns, Trickster. They all released new albums that year. Right. They all had a cut maybe that got some airplay on the radio or MTV, but you're not going to look back and go, oh, what was Trickster or LA Guns known for? No, you're going to go back to the previous albums from 3 or 4 years ago.
Of course.
Not to say the material was bad, but that's what it was. That's why I said up front, it was these 80s bands hanging around. You still had 10, 15 new releases,
right?
But they just didn't have the substance, and it was kind of fading out. Now, granted, I think there were some albums that, were good for the time. I think, King's X, it was a self-titled release. It was, I think, their third album, but had some strong material on there. Lynch Rob's self-titled release, that was their second release, strong material on there. And probably the biggest one, Vern, was Bon Jovi's Keep the Faith.
Right.
I'm certainly not an advocate of that band, but that was probably their last giant,
huge,
like arena rock 80s style album. Yep. That was it. And they were still that arena status. Everybody's still, opening up for them. They're playing the stadiums. So that's what the hair bands were up to. I mean, Ian, what's your take on some of these bands and albums?
Yeah, I mean, I remember a buddy of mine turned me on to the Crimson Idol album from Wasp. And at this point, Blackie had, everybody was gone. Blackie was doing all of the writing and then had a bunch of friends come in to contribute. He had Bob Kulick play guitar, Doug Aldrich play guitar. It was a concept album, complete departure from what, he had done in the past, but still contained a lot of good material. It's something, people may want to check out. The Dog Eat Dog album from Warrant is probably one of their heaviest albums, solid, heavy. And you could see where these bands were trying to maybe follow in the footsteps of somebody like Skid Row or something like that, where they could, finally put out material that was a little bit more in the vein that they wanted to. It wasn't all parties and Sunset Strip kind of thingy. Had a little bit more teeth to it. Was there anything ultra memorable? Nothing that, jumps to mind, but I remember at the time hearing it going, that's a departure. That sounds completely different.
Do you think, there was enough time for them to be having a reaction of the air quote grunge movement, so they were stripping their sound down and getting heavier?
Oh, I'm sure that was part of the interpretation or part of the perception too, because you had, they're looking at bands like Alice in Chains and they're like, well, they're just a hard rock band too, or Soundgarden. They're just a hard rock band too. And those guys were still doing guitar solos. They just were doing them differently. There wasn't, the only guy that was really doing, the 3 guys that were doing 4 guys, sorry. Eddie Van Halen tapped, Steve Vai tapped, Joe Satriani tapped, and Nuno Betancourt tapped. Why? Because it was a fixture of what they did. But you didn't hear, all these other guys trying to do all these flashy solos. The Warrant album, the one thing I remember specifically about it was I don't remember ever previously hearing either a wah or a roto vibe effect on the guitar, where that was something that was very innate to especially Jerry Cantrell. Jerry Cantrell was an avid wah user, used it very well. So, there was a lot of bands, I remember The Lizard by Saigon Kick. Now I had the one big single on there and everything, that kind of came out. That was more of a conceptual type piece, but that was very brooding and dark and heavy. It didn't have any of that kind of Sunset Strip vibe. That's really the only thing. I mean, they stripped it all back. They made it darker. They made it heavier to try to probably coexist with the times and maybe an influence of what was going on.
What about Lynch Mob? When you start talking Sunset Strip and Guitar Gods, George Lynch.
George that album to me is always sacred. You know, those first two Lynch Mob albums are great. Different singer, and he kind of pulled the Jakey Lee on this one. You know, Lance and I talked about it when we did the Badlands. We did a discussion recently on Badlands, and the first album was, you know, you could tell there's that heavy bluesy swagger to it, still smacks you in the face. Second album comes, the kind of reserved bluesy vibe kind of jumps up a little bit more. Lynch did the same thing. You know, he still had some great material on there. There were some rockers, but, you know, a lot of the stuff kind of had this, you know, I call it the George Lynch sound. If you listen to every Lynch Mob album that he's done, there's a sound to it, you know, and it's different than Dokken. You know, it's definitely different than Dokken.
Well, think about these bands we're talking about here, guys.
Yep.
Imagine being in their shoes at this time, right? They see the Seattle sound coming in. The sound is coming in. They're probably desperate to say, you know what, if we want to maintain our status on Elektra Records or Atlantic or the big labels, right? The labels are probably going, what are you guys going to do?
Yeah.
You know, you can't be pulling the same crap from 2 years ago. You got to adapt your sound or we're going to drop you.
Sure.
So these bands, maybe unfairly, maybe they were forced into writing stuff that maybe was a little bit different than what they thought got them on the map to begin with. However, like you said, Ian, maybe it was like, hey, we wanted to always be a little bit more of a heavier rock band, but we weren't allowed to because 88, 89, 90, 91, we had to be kind of on that cheese factor.
Listen,
right?
I got to tell you, the best example I can tell you about all of this is I lived this, you know, coming from what I did, you know, going through and graduating high school. We were a party rock band, man. It was all about Van Halen and Motley Crue and, you know, that kind of stuff. Jump forward into the 90s. We didn't want to lose the old school hard rock vibe. So the band kind of shifted and we ended up, you know, picking up doing stuff that was a little bit more almost, you know, boogie rockish at times, you know, the band we were doing. Still trying to keep one toe in the metal water, you know, and, you know, but we were adapting our sound. And that was one of the things that we did going all the way up through, you know, and I mean, every band does it to an extent, you know, Christ, the Mighty Sabbath, look at those guys, you know, by the time they were getting to their fifth and sixth album, they started, you know, incorporating new ways of doing songs and trying to get things a little bit more up tempo and not so dark and dirgy all the time. Stuff that's a little more, you know, by the time they got to the last two with Ozzy, I mean, you know, Rock and Roll Doctor, I mean, completely different than NIB for sure. You know, so I mean, I think it's a credit to the ones that tried to do it. And I think it was, you know, kudos to them to be able to finally get the ability to maybe do some of the stuff that they wanted to do a little bit more rather than having that cookie cutter from the industry.
And then you'll see who stands out from the pack go forward, right? Because as we get into the mid to late 90s when 80s rock was dead, a fair amount of these 80s bands, they stayed alive and they put albums out. They did their best. They probably were truer to themselves. Yeah. And then you look fast forward is how many of them still have a career 30 years later? A lot of them do.
Oh, of course.
Right. So it's and I think that's what we'll always appreciate about that music growing up was, you know, we love that the band's dedicated. They're lifers to the craft. They're dedicated. Right. So they're not changing around. Right. They still out there and they're alive, which you can't say about a lot of the bands in the new age. So, all right, enough about the 80s bands. What about...
I have one comment about the 80s, and then, well, we'll revisit it again, but just to comment on, you're talking about these 80 bands, they made a career about it. Point we'll talk about a little later is the resurgence of the nostalgia.
Right.
So we'll get to that point, but I do have a couple points about some of our older bands. Well, fuck it, let's get it out of the way now. Kiss, Revenge.
I loved it.
Loved it, too.
one of their best albums.
Yep.
Vinnie Vincent came back, wrote some stuff. Simon had balls. It was great. Just the music on what they have, Unholy. Even Paul to Take It Off. That was a cool song. Domino.
But do you remember that first time hearing? Because Unholy was the first single that they released.
Yeah.
That I was like, holy shit, this is Kiss. Thank you. Not the, fluorescent, spandex copy David Lee Roth vibe. This was cool shit.
I saw the tour down in Binghamton, like second or third date.
Oh yeah.
It was great. Well, you saw the tour, didn't you?
Yeah, I saw it twice. And to go back to the album, I agree with you guys. There was certain sound element to the mix of the songs.
Oh yeah.
It was heavy, but even the melody on songs like Take It Off or
Domino.
Domino, like just cool.
Yeah.
Really, really cool. The album cover, there was like the Kiss sprayed on the side. It looked like an old military bomber plane, the metal side. Yep. They were in their leather coats, their leather jackets. They were badass. Yeah, I saw this tour twice, actually. They did a little intro tour in the spring of the year when this came out, and they did a handful of clubs around the Northeast. I got to see him at the old Lemoore in Brooklyn, which was killer.
Wow.
Right. And then they came back in the fall and they did the tour. And I believe it was Faster Pussycat and Trickster that opened. I saw the opening night in Bethlehem, PA, and it was about a 2-hour show. And I know on that show, they tested a bunch of older songs that were dropped after that show and never played again on that tour. And I know one of them was Christine 16, and I think it was Firehouse and maybe I Want You. So that was a memorable one for me because they road tested these songs and then said, they don't work. They're out. But definitely a big tour, longer show. And this is when Hot in the Shade and Revenge tours kind of got them back on the map to playing the best of all of their eras, not just focusing on the current material. So definitely, I think we all agree this was a top 5 album of us for 1992.
One thing I got to add, at this time, after they released this album, there was an explosion of Kiss cover bands that came out. I remember, at least on the East Coast way, you had Cold Gin, you had Destroyer. There was another one there. I can't think of what they were. And they played like crazy. And I can remember seeing Destroyer in a small club that we used to play at in Utica. And the guitar player with the smoking guitar totally killed the solo. I mean, it was just amazing just to see them. But they were bringing back some of that old vibe that got missed because now you had them turning the corner with this darker look, this heavier sound. So now it's like, okay, all of the 80s stuff is forgotten. Let's jump into the cool stuff again. So it was great.
Absolutely. All right. 2 of the other bigger releases in 92 were Dream Theater's Images and Words and Iron Maiden's Fear of the Dark. I can't say that I am the biggest, aficionado of Dream Theater. I don't know their catalog, but I fully respect them. This was a big album for them and had their probably most famous song, Pull Me Under, and Iron Maiden's Fear of the Dark. What I remember from this period for me was Maiden actually never toured this album in the States, but they did a handful of club shows. And August 1992, they played a club show, just like the Kiss Club show at the Ritz in New York City. And who opened the show? Dream Theater. I was at it. The album itself, Fear of the Dark, it's got some great songs. Is it a full, complete album? One of the more memorable ones we'll go back to in the history of time? No, but I think we could all say that the album cover's cool, the title track is cool, and there's other songs on that. It's a Maiden album. What do you guys think of Fear of the Dark?
I personally, go
ahead, Ian.
I personally love it. I like it, even though the fact, it veers away from their normal, there's usually some conceptual type stuff. This is a little bit more straightforward. This was to me like a personal step pad. So you had, Painkiller in 1990, which was just a freaking slammer kind of comeback. This was Maiden after they had kind of been away for a year or two. And I loved it. When it kicks off with Be Quick or Be Dead, I mean, it's just a freaking, and Fear of the Dark. It's just slamming album. It's got a lot of great material on there. And think of, the song Fear of the Dark was so big that it's, even when they do their live shows, it's one of those sing-along songs. The entire crowd gets into it.
It's an Iron Maiden anthem.
Yeah.
30 years later.
Oh, yeah, huge.
Got to fact check you, bro. I saw the Fear of the Dark tour the day after you saw them in New York City. They started the tour in Rochester. They actually, you saw them in the 8th at the Ritz in June, and then they came to Rochester. We're here for 2 days doing pre-production or rehearsal. They started the tour. Remember, it was played the War Memorial, but they had to curtain it off. It's really sad. There's like 2,000 people there, and the tour ended up probably getting aborted. I think I heard something later on that it was canceled. Shortened, if you will.
Sure.
And so, Fear of the Dark, what would it have on there? Quick or Be Dead.
It had Wasting Love, which became a video and a single.
Yes.
And I remember for me at the time, it was like, what? Wait a minute. This actually is a little slow. It's like a slower song and almost like a maiden ballad if you could have one. And I was like, wow, that's a departure. Not bad, but one that stood out in an odd kind of way.
Yeah. I think they tried to strike lightning again, like From Here to Eternity was sort of like something of Somewhere in Time. And was this the last album with Bruce?
Yes.
Yeah. I remember when Bruce left, and you could tell now because part of the major factor him leaving was the creative non-input on his end. And so.
Well, talking about vocalists that were departing, how about vocalists that were returning? The great Ronnie James Dio comes back to Sabbath.
Love it.
Dehumanizer.
Love it.
I mean, I couldn't wait for this album to come out. We've talked about this many, many times. I missed the boat based on my slight age difference. I didn't get a chance to know them, see them during Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. I couldn't wait for this. The album itself, I think, probably unfairly, I gave it like at the time a 15 out of a star of 10 because I was just so infatuated that they were back. But it still stands up over time. My take on that is it's a little bit more of a complex album. There's a lot of material on it, longer songs and a lot of songs. I think there's like 12 or 13, 14 songs on there.
Yeah.
They got on the Wayne's World film, I think it was it? And that they had Time Machine came out. That wasn't anywhere near the best song on the album. After All, The Dead, Computer God, I is Buried Alive. I mean, good heavy shit.
I is just.
I like Time Machine.
It's like getting hit in the head with a sledgehammer. I is when that riff just. Yeah, it's like, oh my god. TVI.
Well, you don't like time. You don't like. Excuse me, and you don't like Time Machine.
Oh, I do.
I think.
Oh, of course.
I think that's a fun song.
Oh, it is.
I'm not a big fan of it. I just think it wasn't, when I first heard that as the first song coming out, I was actually a little deflated. I was like, oh man, this is what this is going to be, this album. And then, you heard Computer God and After All, The Dead and Master of Insanity. I'm like, this is the Sabbath. But I loved.
Honestly, the Dehumanizer really doesn't follow the same recipe as Heaven and Hell or Mob Rules.
No, this is escalation point. Yeah, with Sabbath.
It gets a little doomy, if you will, and it's a little slower. And I don't want to say prog as in prog rock, but sort of progs along. And
yeah, as I said, those songs are slower, longer, a little bit more complex, a little more mature, and a lot of songs on a lengthy album. Right, tours were great. I saw them 2 or 3 times in the club. I think I saw them with Prong and Exodus. My first of only a handful of times I got to meet some of the members of the band. I had an after pass show at the first Beacon show, and I got to go downstairs to the club area and introduce myself. I introduced myself to Tony, and in a kind of a weird, like, Spinal Tap moment, the only thing I remember was it was so loud in this room that he couldn't hear what I was saying. And I'm doing this, Tony, and I'm telling him, like, talking slow and screaming whatever I wanted to say, and he's holding up his ear going, huh? I can't hear you. Huh? And then it was just like I gave up, and I took a picture with him and Geezer, and I left.
I will say that
Dehumanizer.
I will say Dehumanizer, it literally is like, omniscient to what would be heaven and hell, years later. It's that same kind of vibe, but it works, man. It's just killer material, and Iommi is, he's the riff god. So
there's a couple of albums I want to not let pass, right? Because we still have a couple of the big ones to cover that we didn't get to yet. But to me, there were some debuts this year that are at least worth a shout out. And it was Fear Factory's Soul of a New Machine.
Yeah.
Can't say I was ever a giant fan of these guys, but I respect them for that industrial sound that they brought into the 90s and 2000s. And they were a very, very big player throughout that period. Put a lot of albums out of a high respectable band. And the other one that came with a bit of controversy was Body Count's self-titled with the song Cop Killer. Yeah. Now, again, this album, if you haven't heard it in a long time, it's fucking metal. It's heavy. And it's like, it's thrash, but it's like, there's a bunch of African-American guys. We weren't used to that at that time. 5 black guys playing metal.
Sure. And
you got the actor, rapper Ice-T in there. And then, of course, the controversy that came with the song Cop Killer. It was, it wasn't allowed to be played on radio and that kind of thing. And then, of course, with the killing out in the Rodney King thing that year, I think it was that year later, it became a signature song. So definitely worth calling out those 2 albums for what they were. And even a small mention of Ugly Kid Joe. I never liked them, but they got big and they lasted for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, they were fun for a minute. Yeah.
They were fun. They were unique. They were different. Yeah. They landed on the Ozzy
No More
Tours Part 1. So,
and
props.
In 2023, they just announced a spring and summer tour.
Right.
Yep.
So I guess, they regrouped and they're doing some stuff. Hey, if we're doing, tidbits and show notes, 92 saw Slayer drummer Dave Lombardo leave for Paul Bastoff.
Yep.
Major singer change. Vince Neil out of the crew. John Coralby in.
They should have kept them.
Yeah, we'll touch base on that in a couple years when they release something. Right. And Metallica's James Hetfield. That was when he got all burned up on that GNR Metallica tour up in Montreal.
Yep.
That was serious.
Who was the replacement guitarist that came in and took over for him in the road?
Jim Marshall.
Trivia question.
Jim Marshall.
Come on.
His tech.
Yeah. Formerly of Metal Church.
Not to be confused with Jim Marshall, the guy that created Marshall amps.
Yeah. All right, I'll give you a hard trivia question.
All right.
On the Freddie Mercury tribute show in 1992, who sang the song Innuendo?
Was it Axl Rose?
Nope.
No, it was. Was that when Gary Sharon?
Nope. He sang Extreme Played.
Yeah,
it was Robert Plant.
That's right. Listen.
And who sang the song I Want It All at the Queen 1992 tribute show?
You're really making me
Roger
think.
Daltrey.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
And Tony Iommi played at that show as well. I think he may have played out on stage as well on I Want It All.
I think he played for almost everything on the set because him and May are like this anyways. Listen, the one non-metal moment here, but one of the most memorable vocal performances closing the show was George Michael doing Somebody to Love. If nobody's ever seen it, if you know the song and you've heard Freddie do it, go watch that performance on YouTube. It makes the hairs on your neck stand up. And I don't have any, but they still stand up.
Well, when you did, they stood up.
That's right.
All right.
Guys, there's one album we're leaving out that was in our top 5 we didn't really talk about was Megadeth's Countdown to Extinction. It was a big one. It was a great one. It was a good tour.
Yeah.
Guys, tear this one apart for us.
So this was, to me, this was either, I don't know if it was by Dave's design or if it was record company design. This was kind of like following along after the Black Album. Let's see if we can try to create some of that kind of vibe. But it's still a slamming album. And it's so fun. High speed dirt. the song Countdown to Extinction, Angry Again. I mean, all of these songs were in constant rotation. And it was just a really heavy, fun album. And it was another one of those albums that basically, flipped the bird to all the alternative people, because, they were, bashing anything that was hard rock and metal, because if you didn't wear flannels and smell like body odor, you weren't cool. So I really dug it. Vern? Countdown?
Oh, yeah, Countdown, it had those staples. It's no Rust in Peace. It's no Peace Sells.
Right.
It's, honestly, I don't think it aged that well. Maybe it's just, you hear it too much, Sweating Bullets. But, Skin on My Teeth, that's a cool song. Countdown,
Yep.
And Angry Again isn't on that album.
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad.
Yeah. But
it was that band at its second stage of rebirth, right? Right. It was the Marty Friedman era now, and they were solid, right? From Rust in Peace, and then this album, and the few more to come. That was that pocket, like the second phase of life of that band that put them back on the map.
Right. Yep.
And they had a slightly different sound, and they were at their high point. I love these albums. I love these tours. They were really, really good.
Yeah, this was the middle album when we talk about like those Trinity albums or trilogy, between this, you had Rust in Peace, Countdown, Euthanasia with Friedman. And there's a certain continuity, even though Rust is just like stratosphere type album. These albums are still good, and you could tell that they were in a good vibe writing wise. When they finally get to, stuff we're going to talk to down the road, it kind of makes a little bit of a shift.
I honestly think it's, it may be a generational disconnect, but I go the other way. The
early
first one. Yeah, the first one up until including Rust.
Yeah, I'm still always back and forth with that first Killing Is My Business. I do love, So Far So Good, So What, and Peace Sells, but Who's Buying this stuff? But it's, the first one to me, I think a lot of it is the production. It's just
the production, and and to tell you the truth, they went ahead and remastered everything, and it sounds worse.
Oh.
I don't know what the hell they did. Maybe some of it too. I had a chance to.
Well, you saw it live, right?
Yeah,
right.
And I remember when waiting for, and when they came out, and when looking down the cross and
right.
Last Rites and that whole thing. But you're right, the mix on that.
Yeah.
But then that went straight into Peace Sells.
Oh yeah. And Peace Sells is a great album. Yeah.
Like Wake Up Dead, Good Morning Black Friday.
Yep.
Just my experience or my interpretation. Yeah. But Walt, you're right. Countdown, it is a commercially and their next step. They had to try to match the Metallicas, and they weren't successful. Right. To this day, a lot of those songs are still in the set list.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yep.
So, overplayed, but they were big songs for them.
Yeah. That seemed to be the cohesive piece to everything that came out in the 90s. Overplay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like Foreclosure of a Dream's a great song.
Yeah.
Euthanasia
too, though. Just like Angry Again. Right?
No, Foreclosure's on.
Oh, is it? See, I get them mixed up, man. They're very close. That's why,
Too many bubblers in the 90s.
Of course.
Yeah. All right, what else we got? Let's go back to the 80s for a little bit and talk about Damn Yankees. Yeah.
So much fun. So much fun.
Now, Walt, you say there's a drop off from the debut to Don't Tread?
I think the album is good as a whole. It just didn't have those 3 or 4 songs that,
right.
The MTV hits and the videos and that kind of thing. I mean, the title track is cool. Just the album cover's cool. The old hillbilly looking dude putting his arm out, back in a pickup truck, and his mouth's open. But the material is strong. It's just a shame that this was like a super group that was weirdly fit in at a strange time and a changing of music, and it just didn't last more than these 2 albums. But I didn't see this tour, but I loved it. I love the album.
Well, let me ask you, quite possibly, did their 15 minutes of fame run up?
I think it was a combination of, there were 4 big names, and the first album put them up so big. They had the hits. It was also in the late 80s to 1990. The scene changed, and that was it.
I think the scene
I'm sorry,
changes.
that's a damn Yankee joke, because the second song, 15 minutes of fame.
Oh, sorry. I missed that one. We'll have to edit that part out.
I think the scene change is probably the biggest thing, though. That's probably what shot them right in the foot. You know, any momentum that they started to try to build off from, the first single, just, it was too much.
These guys are they still had their other careers. Styx has never really gone away. Ted always did his solo stuff anyway. Night Ranger, I don't know if they ever really paused, but they became a staple by the mid to late 90s, and they're still out there 30 years later.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't it right around this time that I don't think they really did a whole big tour for this album. And within like the next year or so, wasn't Shaw Blades trying to do stuff, and Ted went back to his solo stuff. So,
honestly, to tell you the truth, me and a good friend, Kale Jammer, we saw this tour tons. There was the time period where they were always touring with Bad Company. The Brian Howe era of Bad Company, and I didn't even. I barely like Bad Company with Paul Rogers. Then you got to have a scrub singer doing it.
Oh, now. This is where the throwdown.
Okay, a scab singer.
I know, it was amazing. Amazing. Those albums, Holy Water, No Smoke Without a Fire. Good shit, man.
All right. Well,
listen to Verno. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And
we'll
Paul
save
Rogers
that
is a top 10 rock singer of all time.
We'll save that for a rock and roll detention.
Yeah,
but I gotta fact check myself. And Pile Driver was on the first one. Uprising.
That's it. Yes.
Uprising was the song on Don't Tread. But
still both great songs.
Yeah, that was still good stuff. All right, well, what else we got on here before we get out of here? Is there, here, I got a little something. We talked about, the splintering of the music scene, rock bands, metal bands, alternative bands, new metal's out there, goth is getting its point. But, a lot of those other bands were still, like Walt said earlier, Yngwie's still putting shit out, Man-O-War's doing stuff, Merciful Fate. They're getting stuff out. Yeah. Motorhead. They got March or Die coming out. Testament, The Ritual, which is a great album. Because they really only started in 97, 98.
87.
Or 87 or 88.
Yep,
so
you're correct.
Their career was young. So Skid Row, they're putting out B-side, Slaughter.
Wild Side was, unfortunately, that was that last big album, and that was when Tim, his name always escapes me, the guitar player, was diagnosed with cancer.
From Slaughter?
From Slaughter. He ended up...
The Wild Life.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, he ended up dying, I think, in 92 or 93. It was sad, because remember that time period, you had stuff going back, you had your, Steve Ray Vaughan, and then you had Eric Carr, and, then you had these guys, it was all these...
Freddie.
Yeah, Freddie, all these old soldiers that, were all dear to us. And you're like, oh my God, I can't believe, and they're gone in a flash. So, the one that I wanted to call out too, when you were talking about the old guard, Neil Schon put out the band. Hey, listen, it's a good hard rock album, man. Double Eclipse. They had that first single, Hot Sherry, that came out. From Hardline, and it's a pretty cracking album. This was, I think I told Vern this one night when we were having a conversation. I probably had been tipping a few, and he doesn't anymore. So I get motor mouthed and I keep going. This was one of those life preserver albums for me, along with the Lynch Mob and, Voodoo Highway and stuff at that point, as a guy who played guitar and liked hard rock and heavy metal. And this album came out, man, and I was like, holy shit, this is the same Neil Schon that just got done doing, what he was doing beforehand.
Bad English.
Bad English, thank you. John Wade, I can't think of the singer's name. But, it's really a good album. The band itself was started by two brothers, and they've continued to go on. Neil has jumped on stage with them and jammed a couple different times, but after this, he ended up, reforming Journey, and, the rest is history for him because they're celebrating 100 years on the road this year or something like that or whatever.
I'm not the biggest fan that knowledgeable, but guitar god Tony McAlpine. Yeah.
Tony's a beast. How about?
Well, you know what?
Oh,
go ahead. No, I was just going to wrap things up. We can go on all day. There's just. Well,
I just wanted to throw out. We had talked before, and I know that we all have an affinity for the band Trouble, but Manic Frustration was put out this year, and this is a slamming album. So anybody, do yourself a favor and go ahead and check it out if you haven't already.
Eric Wagner.
The Sleepers.
The
Sleeper.
Rest in peace, Eric Wagner.
Absolutely.
AC/DC.
Oh, the live.
They released the live album from the previous tour.
Yep.
Live albums are live albums. It's just loaded with all their hits. It's the video's pretty cool.
Oh,
it's one of those. I think it was filmed at Castle Donington or something. Or
and remember you could get that big pack that actually had the two CDs and the VHS in it at the time. Yeah. Freaking killer, man.
Yeah, 100,000 or 200,000 people, and the crowd's just jumping up and down there and thunderstruck. So
that just goes to show the power of some of those bands, especially like in AC/DC in '92. Just telling everybody right there, we still rock.
Well, yeah. All right, Walt, what do we got coming up in 1993? Anything off the top of your head, or is there any 92 tidbits you want to wrap up?
No tidbits on 92. 93, though, is very similar to 92, and it's an abundance of releases, lots and lots and lots of bands releasing albums, that mix of, all the different types of metal and classic metal and new metal and vintage metal. The 90s scene, the grunge era, it's still all out there. Again, it's going to be a lot of the same theme going forward. We're going to see these years where it's not going to have 10 standouts like it was in 1987. We're going to have to pick out the best that we feel are the most appropriate. I mean, there were some killer releases in 93. I'm not going to lie. We'll save that for next time.
Right.
One of my personal favorite metal albums of all time. Was released in 1993.
Wow.
And I'll leave it at that. Let the suspension linger.
Okay. Ian, any parting shots?
I'm just glad we got a chance to do this again, and I look forward to 93 because it has some favorites of mine as well, and the unfortunate passing of probably one of my biggest influences that same year.
Okay, well, the teases are there. Again, get up to that website, download some past shows. Do us a favor, send us an email. Say, hey, Vernomatic, you're full of shit. Get off the lawn. Metal Walt knows it all. Or go the other way and say, hey, Brian Howe is a scrub. In any case, join us. Thank you for listening, and always remember to keep it heavy. See ya.
Metal for life.
Thank you for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our website at metalmayhemroc.com for information on podcasts, archives, links to all our live radio shows, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. And always remember to keep it heavy.